Fictional stories are weird. Why is that we can feel so much for something that isn't real? Why can a made-up character make us feel genuine loss or genuine happiness? There's something strange about that, and that's exactly why I love them. It doesn't matter if it's a novel written by one of the greatest authors out there, or a web novel written by someone just starting out, they all have the potential to make us feel something real. Gacha games are no different. Wuthering Waves, despite its shortcomings, always had that potential, but only recently it feels like we've actually started to see it come together, and a big part of that came with Aemeath. There's no denying the impact that moment had on the story. It was the first time everything really clicked. Up until then, the narrative always felt like an unfinished puzzle. The pieces were there, and they were good, but they just weren't in the right place yet. Something was missing, and Aemeath felt like that missing piece. But even with that shift, there's still one question that remains. Was that just a one-time moment? Or is this the direction the story is actually moving towards? And if it is, then who's next? Who's going to carry the same weight and prove that Aemeath wasn't just an exception? I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and with the arrival of Denia and Hiyuki, I think we might already have the answer. Because out of the two, Denia stands out in a very different way, and personally, I think she has the potential to be just as impactful. So what actually makes a character interesting? Why did Aemeath become such a beloved character almost overnight, to the point where she instantly became that character for the entire community? Was it the way she was introduced in the story, or the twists surrounding her and how everything built up towards that final moment, or was it something much simpler than that? At the end of the day, what stands out the most is the choice she made. Despite the fear, despite everything she knew was going to happen, she still chose to sacrifice herself for the person she cared about the most, and there is something very human about that. It is a simple decision on the surface, but at the same time it carries a lot of emotional weight. However, I don't think it was just that moment on its own that made her so impactful. I believe what truly made Aemeath stand out was her relationship with the protagonist. A character, no matter how well written they are, cannot exist in isolation, because if they do, they will never hit the same way. What gives a character real weight is how they connect to others, the emotional context behind those relationships, and the way they influence and are influenced by the people around them. And that is exactly why Aemeath worked. So when we look at Denia and the idea that she could become the next character to carry the same level of impact, the first question we need to ask is actually quite simple. Who is Denia? Even with how little we have seen so far, we already know something important about her. She is Aleph 1's resonator, and from everything that has been shown to us, this does not feel like a choice she made. It feels like something that was forced onto her, and that alone already tells us quite a lot about the kind of character we are dealing with. When we look at her behavior, she comes across as distant, uninterested, and almost detached from everything around her, like she is physically present but not really engaged with anything that is happening. And naturally, that raises the question of why she is like this. I think it all ties back to Aleph 1. Out of everyone, she is the one who understands it the most. She knows exactly what it's capable of, and more importantly, she understands the scale of the threat it represents in a way that no one else really does. That kind of knowledge inevitably changes a person. It creates fear, but more than that, it creates a sense of utility. The feeling that no matter what you do, it will never be enough. If that is the case, then her behavior starts to make a lot more sense. What makes this even more interesting, however, is her connection to Sigrica. This does not feel like a random interaction. It feels deliberate, like there is a reason behind it that has not been fully revealed yet. In a story that is starting to pay more attention to how characters are connected, relationships like this are rarely meaningless. And if Aemeath showed us anything, it is that relationships are where these stories hit the hardest. So if Denia is going to reach that same level of impact, it will not just come from what she is, but from who she connects to and how those relationships are developed moving forward. There are two directions I want to approach when it comes to Denia. The first one is the idea of a sympathetic antagonist, because if what we've seen so far is accurate, then Denia wouldn't be the first character to fall into this category. We already had Prolova, and to be fair, her story was emotional, it had weight, and it had the foundation to be something really impactful. However, structurally, it didn't fully land. The moment her arc ended, the story simply moved on, even though there were still questions left unanswered, and narrative threads that could have been explored further. especially when it comes to her connection with the protagonist. Instead of building on that, the story left it behind, and that is ultimately what held it back. Even though that connection existed, it wasn't developed enough to fully stay with you. Now with Denia, this is where things could be different. If she is truly being set up as another sympathetic antagonist, someone who is not necessarily evil but shaped by circumstances beyond her control, then this becomes a second chance to approach that kind of story properly. And with the level of writing we've seen recently, I think they actually have the ability to do it. If they take their time with her, if they commit to her arc, and if they properly build her relationships instead of just introducing them and moving on, then her story could end up hitting much harder than Frolovas ever did. Not because the idea itself is different, but because the execution might finally match the potential that was always there. The second angle, and the one I personally find even more interesting, is her relationship with Sigrica. This is not something that feels random. There is clearly a reason why Denia approached her, and in a story like this, especially one that is starting to place more emphasis on character relationships, interactions like this rarely exist without meaning. There is always something behind them. What stands out the most to me is the contrast between the two. Denia feels detached, like someone who has already accepted how things are going to end, someone who understands the scale of what she is connected to and has, in a way, given up trying to fight against it. Sigrica, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. She is driven, hopeful, and constantly looking forward instead of looking away, and that contrast is important. I don't think Denia was drawn to Sigrica by accident, whether she realizes or not. I think she was drawn to something she no longer has, and that is hope. When we look at the way she interacts with Sigrica, especially the way she keeps telling her to stop trying so hard, to give up, or to not chase expectations, it doesn't really feel like advice, it feels like projection. It feels like she is trying to convince Sigrica of something she has already convinced herself of. This is where the relationship becomes really interesting. Depending on how the story develops, this could go in a lot of different directions. It could be a story about pulling someone back from that age, about rediscovering that sense of purpose, or it could be the opposite way and turn into a conflict where those differences simply cannot coexist. But regardless of the direction they choose, this is where the emotional core of Denia's story is most likely going to be, not just what she is, but in who she connects to. And if the game builds on this properly, then this relationship alone could carry some of the most impactful moments in the story going forward. Now I want to take this in a slightly different direction and talk about a theory I've been thinking about for a while, especially when it comes to Aemeath and how her story might continue from here. Ever since Aemeath sacrificed herself, there has been this constant question floating around: can she be saved? And if she can, then what would it cost to bring her back? But for me, the question was never really whether she can be saved or not. The way the story is structured, it already feels like it's building towards that outcome, so it almost feels inevitable that we are going to reach that point eventually. The real question, at least in my opinion, is what are the consequences of that decision? Because a moment like that cannot just be undone without a cost. There has to be something that balances it out, something that carries weight, otherwise it risks losing the impact that made it so powerful in the first place. Now, I've seen different opinions on this. Some people believe that the consequences are going to fall on Aemeath herself, that even if she comes back, she won't come back the same. But I don't think that's the right direction. Aemeath has already paid the price for her actions. She made the choice, she faced the consequences, and she carried that burden all the way through. Adding more on top of that would not necessarily make the story better. It would just feel like overdoing it, especially when there are other places where those consequences could be much more impactful. The most obvious alternative would be the protagonist, and for a long time that was actually my main theory, that in order to save Aemeath, the protagonist would have to sacrifice something important in return. Something meaningful, something that actually carries emotional weight. However, now with Denia in the picture, I think there is another possibility that might be even more interesting. What if the cost doesn't fall on Aemeath, and if it doesn't fall on the protagonist either, but instead falls on Denia? When you look at how her character is being set up, she is already positioned in a very unique place. She is connected to Aleph 1, she understands the scale of that power, and she already carries the sense of detachment, that feeling that she has, in a way, already given up. At the same time, we have her relationship with Sigrica, who represents the exact opposite, someone who is driven, hopeful, and constantly pushing forward. And if that relationship actually matters, If Sigrica ends up influencing Denia in a meaningful way, then there is a possibility that Denia herself might change. If that happens, then the question becomes, what kind of choice would she make at that point? One direction this could take, and one that I personally find very interesting, is the idea that Denia, despite everything, chooses to sacrifice herself in order to save Aemeath. If the story goes in that direction, then that single decision could define her entire character. It wouldn't just resolve Aemeath's situation, it would also turn Denia into a character with the same kind of emotional impact, built around a very human choice, a painful one, but one that carries meaning because of who is it made for. And if that happens, then Denia wouldn't just be another important character in the story, she could become the kind of character that stays with people in the same way Aemeath did. Of course, this is just a theory, and the story could go in a completely different direction, but no matter how they choose to resolve Aemeath's situation, that moment is going to matter a lot, and as long as they handle it properly, there is a real chance that it becomes one of the most impactful turning points in the entire story. This is exactly why I enjoyed 3.2 as much as I did. I know that a lot of people disagree with that, and I've seen quite a few opinions saying that 3.2 felt slow or that it didn't really do much, and to some extent I can understand where that comes from, because it was definitely a slower episode compared to what people might have expected. However, for me, that's exactly why it works so well. What 3.2 does is something that not a lot of gacha stories manage to do properly, and that is taking a step back from constant progression and instead focusing on building the foundation of what comes next. It introduces characters, it builds relationships, and more importantly, it starts structuring the narrative in a much more deliberate and cohesive way than what we had before. And this is exactly the role that a chapter like this should have. Not every part of a story needs to be explosive or filled with constant action. Some parts need to exist specifically to set things up, to connect narrative threads, and to give meaning to the moments that will come later. Without that kind of groundwork, even the biggest moments can end up feeling empty. And I think 3.2 understands that very well. When you look at everything it introduces, whether we are talking about Denia, her relationship with Sigrica, the hints around Aleph 1, or even the direction the protagonist seems to be moving in, none of these elements feel isolated anymore. They feel like pieces of a larger structure that is slowly starting to come together. And that is what makes this chapter so important. If they take everything they built here, all these relationships, all these subtle narrative setups, and actually use them properly going forward, then the payoff is going to hit so much harder than anything we have seen so far. That kind of impact doesn't come just from big moments on their own, it comes from everything that leads up to them and gives them weight. This is also why I am optimistic about where the story is heading. For the first time in a while, it feels like Wuthering Waves is no longer just experimenting with different ideas, but is actually starting to build towards something more intentional, something that, if handled correctly, could take its storytelling to a completely different level. Now, of course, this still depends entirely on what they do next. They still need to follow through on what they set up here, and they still need to commit to this direction instead of shifting away from it again. But if they do, then what we've seen in 3.2 might not just be a slower chapter in the story, but the foundation for something much bigger. And honestly, I'm really looking forward to seeing how they build on this from here. That's pretty much where I stand on this. I might be completely off with some of these ideas, especially when it comes to Denia and how her story is going to play out, but I think that's part of what makes this so interesting right now. For the first time in a while, it actually feels like there are multiple directions the story can take, and each one of them has the potential to lead to something genuinely impactful. At the end of the day, all of this really comes down to execution. The setup is there, the characters are there, the relationships are there, and now it's just a matter of whether they're going to follow through on it or not. Personally, I think they're in a really good spot right now, and if they continue building on what they started in 3.2 instead of stepping away from it, then there's a real chance that Wuthering Waves could reach a completely different level when it comes to storytelling. But we'll have to wait and see. Let me know what you think about this, especially when it comes to Denia. I'm really curious how you guys see her role in the story going forward, and whether you think she's going to be as important as she seems right now, or if this is just another setup that might not fully pay off. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.